Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook, college football, week 2 on the docket. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. But this is the perfect time to remind you to go to FanDuelSportsbook.com/BetTheBoard. Use the promo code BetTheBoard. Take advantage of all the generous promotions that FanDuel has available for you just in time for the NFL regular season. Whether it's a 40-1 promotion on a $5 bet or $1,000 risk-free wager in states where it applies, FanDuel has you covered all football season long. Rules and restrictions apply. Most promotions apply to new users only. Payne, it only took us 1 week, but I think all of our listenership is officially on the South Alabama Jaguars bandwagon.
Why wouldn't you be? Great school, great program, great defensive line, NFL talent out wide. Got to tell you, you start to watch that game, and you're like, here we go again. Here we go again. It's like ball just not going in our direction. But fortunately, South Alabama, the far better team, just dominated. The defensive line was great. But, yeah, that's kind of our bag here. Maybe, we're not quite sure yet, maybe we go against the grain this week, and we fade South Alabama. We'll see. Possibly the best bet.
We do have to give a hat tip to the student managers that will work in the handy cam on the sidelines. I know you and I commiserated, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners did, watching this game on ESPN+, trying to figure out if that game was actually shot from a Sputnik satellite 50,000 feet above the earth, and what kind of diagonals we were going to get. But alas, always good to get the first college football winner of the bank, build some of that momentum, and get things rolling.
When you spend $5 a month, I expect yardage on my down and distance. That's all I'm asking for.
I figured you wanted 4K, you wanted HD, you wanted the ability for an all 22 type experience when you were dissecting the film in the aftermath of that contest.
We did get lucky on one fumble. They go to the replay, and it looks like they're recording from a treehouse, 50 yards away from the stadium. And I'm like, we may get lucky this time.
Hey, every now and again, it's good to have Lady Luck smiling upon you. Did want to give you a chance, though, before we get into the 4 big games we have on tap for today, along with the first release of our Bet the Board Top 10, and allow you to encapsulate, revisit, kind of put a bow on what we saw transpire Monday night from your beloved Noles in that Sunday night, I should say, in that Labor Day weekend thriller.
It's one of those things where everyone heard us break this game down. We talked about Florida State in the ACC preview podcast. And you go into the game just saying, show a respectable performance here. Have some cap integrity on defense. Look like you have a clue. And so from that perspective, I thought it was a fantastic performance. You exceeded expectations. And the show that was put on, 80,000, packed house, the Bobby Bowden ceremony, Mike Norvell being extremely strategic, inviting recruits on campus this weekend, knowing Miami, Alabama was a neutral site game, knowing Georgia, Clemson was a neutral site game, knowing LSU, who you're competing with for a couple recruits, was across the country in UCLA. So the timing was perfect. And by all accounts, the recruits had a great time, and I think that was a good showing. But then you get to the point in the game where it's 35-38, and you're like, holy shit, let's pull this thing off. So it was a kick in the nuts from that perspective. And there's still issues. The offensive line isn't great. I think it'll be Jordan Travis is going to be the starting quarterback here. Mackenzie Milton is not at a point where he can play every single game and prepare every single week for the game. So that's going to be the situation there. You just hope the offensive line stays healthy enough. But there was progress, and that was the positive, seeing that. So You do need that win, though, because, again, the goal here is getting to 6. That's the Super Bowl, getting to 6 wins and getting to a bowl game. And it becomes a little bit tougher when you're right there and just can't pull it off. So it's a great performance, but you wake up the next morning, you're like, man, we could have had that one.
Yeah, it's always tough because you obviously go out there and before the game you say, hey, look, we could lose by a field goal. I think a lot of Florida State fans, yourself included, would have signed off on it, especially when they erased an 18-point deficit in the fourth when it looked like things were going to get away. But as you've always talked about, and I think a lot of our listeners should understand, regardless of what teams they root for, unless they're Alabama fans, you go from losing big to losing small to winning big, and hopefully that's a sign of what we're going to see out of Mike Norvell's bunch going forward, as I know a lot of our loyal listeners follow along with Florida State, and it becomes their adopted team, given your passion. But I did find an interesting quote on Twitter, and I'm glad you dispelled it pretty quickly, that you said, it's all about who I bet, and I think that's important to get across to folks out there, that Payne may be a Florida State fan when no money's involved, but if there's an angle to be had betting against Florida State, Payne will be running over men, women, and children to try and be able to make that wager. So I just want to be clear with that.
What's so interesting about that game, too, because you sit there and you say, hey, at one point this game was 38-20, but you're up 14-7 at one point. You rebounded after a very slow start, and you start to think about things from a general point of view, and it's like the defensive line dominated. I know Notre Dame is young up front, but it's a really talented group. Williams did virtually nothing. And so that was a positive to see. But again, just generally looking at it, it's like, you lost by 3 in overtime. Jack Cohn probably played the best game he's ever played on a college football field.
Oh, get that man a Heisman Trophy. Get that man in the Heisman conversation.
You were -3 in turnover differential. You were -5 in penalties. And so when you start to look at it from that perspective, it's like, you're still kind of beating yourself. And so if you don't do that, what does the score look like? So that's the positive from that game.
Yeah, it's always one of those things when you look at it, whether it be Florida State or 129 other teams in the FBS level, you don't want to overreact to what you see week one. You also don't want to underreact. We'll get a much better indication of exactly what the Irish are going forward. Not a game that'll make our top 4 this week, but you've already seen money come in on Toledo, so we'll see how Notre Dame handles a little bit of prosperity when the Rockets come in there in a game that about 9 people will be able to watch on Peacock. But either way, Notre Dame, spoiler alert, does not crack our first edition of the Bet the Board top 10 for this season. Drum roll, please, Payne. Would you like to start with teams ranked 10 through number 6 as we hit on the 4 at the bottom of the top 10?
Ooh, that's how you want to go.
Yeah, let's go a little reverse order here. Let's create a little drama because I know everyone's sitting on their edge of their seat waiting for us to unveil number 1.
UTSA, no one wanted to hear about them?
I mean, you could talk about the Roadrunners if you want. Everyone loves a little Frank Harris.
Number 10 is Utah. And I think most know at this point I'm a little higher on Utah than the market. Other respected bettors seem to be as well. We went over their win total. We saw Utah outperform expectation week 1 against Weber State, who top 10 FCS team. And we already saw them get steamed this week in the rivalry game against BYU. So there's clear, market discrepancy from what odds makers believe this team to be and what respected bettors believe this game to be. And so I thought they actually performed very well. When you dig a little bit deeper, they had the 100-yard kickoff return they gave up. Weber State recovered a fumble, and it was a 24-yard scoring drive. The final touchdown Utah gave up was in garbage time. So the scoreboard was a little misleading there for me. So I like Utah. We moved them up again, even though we were higher on them than most, and that's who rounds out our top 10.
And number 9, an American Athletic Conference member.
Yeah, I was a little uncertain on this one, but it's really interesting. I want to give a little love to the G5. I think the performance they had in the opener was really surprising to me. I was shocked. I mean, Miami, Ohio's no slouch. I think they're one of the better MAC teams. Last year, they beat the MAC champion before their season ultimately ended. Spread was 22.5. They were up 35-0 at the break. Desmond Ridder has been in college football for what feels like 8 years now. And so,
which is still 8 years less than Jake Bentley, actually.
Yes, Jake Bentley. Slandering guys that get you to the window is just bad karma, Todd. We're gonna have you figure that out here pretty soon.
Eventually I'll learn. It's just going to take me a little while.
You know, you have two solid backs. You probably have the best receiver corps at Cincinnati and God knows how long. A real strong O-line. And again, just a one-game sample size, but through 60 minutes, Cincy now owns the number one EPA differential in college football. So let's see if they can keep that up and keep playing at this level.
People are already circling Cincy's two big games against Indiana and Notre Dame coming up in the not-so-distant future if we're going to have a chance for a group of 5 team to crash the party. But knowing Cincinnati's luck, watch them win both of those games and get boat raced by UCF in conference play. At number 8, a team hailing from the Big Ten.
I hate doing this because I don't really like Penn State, but here we are. Listen, when you start digging into like these teams, like teams 8 through 20, we have a grand total of about 2.5 points separating those 13 teams, which means a point up 1 week, point down. Suddenly the 8th power rated team's the 17th a week from now. Okay. But you do go into a hostile environment on the road. You win outright as 5.5 point dogs, even if you're outgained. I'll move you up a few spots, especially when you look at LSU, UNC, Miami, all losing, and then Oregon, Florida, and Notre Dame performing below expectation. The best thing to me about Penn State right now is their OC, Mike Yurcich. But I am still skeptical with Sean Clifford, and I'm still skeptical about their defensive line. We'll see what comes of Penn State. This is just kind of where they had to be based on history, based on our data points with how they finished last season. And obviously you do have to give some credit to going on the road in that environment. They haven't played in front of fans for an entire year. And now all of a sudden, poof, you're at Wisconsin in a packed house. You got to give them credit for that one.
And a Penn State team that we're not going to necessarily get tested this week against Ball State, but next week, a great intersectional showdown when they take on SEC member Auburn. So it should be a fun watch. A team, Payne, at number 7 that found themselves open as a 31.5 point favorite in their season opener. That number got bet down to 28. Awfully tough to cover a 4-touchdown spread when you only score 16 points in a winning effort.
Ugly performance against Northern Iowa, but you kind of see that coming. Iowa State is our 7th place team. Matt Campbell gets my lucky number 7. We talked on the Big 12 preview about slow Septembers for Matt Campbell. You add to the fact that you have your in-state rival Iowa on deck, and you're in this sleepy situation. I'm still uncomfortable having Iowa State this high just because of how they recruit. But again, teams 8 through 15 are really muddled here. This is the big test this week to figure out what Iowa State's peak can be in my mind. But it's just a solid team, right? Good offensive line, great innovative defense, Brock Purdy, a quarterback, a stud at running back. It just feels like this is where Iowa State should be placed right now. And we'd have them favored over the teams that are just right behind them. So I'm comfortable for now. Let's see what this weekend produces in the Cyhawk game.
Number 6, involved in maybe the single greatest point spread drama of the entire Week 1 schedule for all the wrong reasons. If folks were watching late in that contest, they were treated to something truly special.
The old kick off the upright to end the game from about 17 yards out. Did you watch the end of that, the whole thing?
You know what? I wasn't watching in real time, but when you texted me and said, hey, we got real point spread drama in College Station, I actually went back later that night after the late games were over and watched the final 5 minutes to see Kent State miss not 1, but 2 field goals inside the 5. But what was even better about the Golden Flashes, Payne, the way they played it out, they didn't throw the ball into the end zone once. I know it's not their DNA, but they were more than comfortable trying to set up for that chip shot field goal to get inside the numbers, 29.5 point pups.
And Jimbo was happy as hell. Just got the big contract, and all of a sudden the upright provided some much-needed help to his boosters as well. We have A&M at 6. I like what I saw in defense. That's not a shock. A&M has a chance to be a top 5 defense when the dust settles on efficiency. The hope is that the offense catches up, and Haynes King gets better with each start. He's a dual-threat quarterback, which I really like. We know how Jimbo really improves the quarterback position. The goal is obviously to have Haynes King ready for October 9th against Alabama. And I think he's got a chance to gain some confidence from now until then when you look at the schedule of defenses coming up. And just overall, I think these are really, as we start to get into this, A&M starts the group of teams that actually have the capability of winning a championship.
Hey, it's like you said, if they can get quarterback play, they become extremely intriguing. So we'll get a better indication of what A&M is. Maybe not this week as a 2-touchdown plus favorite on a neutral site against Colorado, but in the coming weeks for sure. At number 5, Payne, a team that looked dynamite for stretches, especially in the first half. And as we've seen way too frequently, they take their foot off the gas in the second half and take an easy game and a rocking chair winner into almost one of the week one's biggest outright upsets.
Sooners at number 5, and bottom line, like, Spencer Rattler needs to be better. Too much cool guy stuff going on from him, too much focus off the field. He wasn't very good. O-line did a great job keeping him clean, but he had an 83 passer rating from a clean pocket. His second pass of the season was picked off where he was late and then threw into triple coverage. 2 picks on the day, should have been 3, was bailed out on a PI call. Alex Grinch's defense wasn't great defending the pass. And so I didn't love what I saw. It just felt to just kind of going through the motions. And you listen to Rattler, at least he had some self-awareness, because after the game, he basically said that Tulane just wanted it more. And I think maybe you chalk this one up to taking Tulane lightly, but there are some signs there. And this is the NIL era. And you and I have discussed this off air. But there are going to be new handicapping elements in situations. When you see quarterbacks getting paid $1 million, is that dude taking care of the guys around him? Because that is what's going to be expected. And so that creates an interesting dynamic in that locker room.
You got to hope that he's bringing as much Raising Cane's as possible to his offensive linemen and keeping those big boys in front of him fed, especially when the schedule gets significantly more difficult for the Oklahoma Sooners. The number 4 team in the poll, Payne, still looking for their first touchdown of 2021.
We touched on Clemson a little bit last week. The defense is stout. It just comes down to if DJ can be elite. The O-line takes a step forward and Shipley emerges and Ross becomes the guy he was pre-neck injury. Right now, Clemson's number 4. Too many questions offensively. We know offense is more valuable than defense. Didn't want to make this broad, sweeping, precipitous drop, but I will say this. Unless the quarterback play continues to be elite, and they are recruiting elite quarterbacks down the line, there's a Manning that right now is favoring Clemson. We'll see. But you are starting to get a little bit of a vibe here, Todd, that this might be the start of Clemson starting to take a downtick as a program.
It's going to bear watching. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me, and hey, look, it's not to discount anything that Georgia does on the defensive side. There didn't seem to be any burners. Clemson couldn't get separation, and the biggest question we had coming into the game was with that Georgia secondary. There were no opportunities downfield, and Clemson made 0 adjustments. They didn't do anything to max protect. They didn't try and give DJ extra time in the pocket, and we've seen this before from the Tigers. So not quite as anemic an offensive effort, but definitely some cause for concern going forward, despite the ACC not exactly looking dominant as a conference from top to bottom. And Payne, we'll accelerate this because I don't think any of these trio will surprise people. At number 3, a team that we'll break down in about 2 minutes from now, the Ohio State Buckeyes. At number 2, the team that knocked off Clemson, the Georgia Bulldogs. At number 1, a team that looks like they're playing a different sport than anybody else in college football, the Alabama Crimson Tide. Just wasn't sure if you had any things to add for that trio of teams before we get into the meat and potatoes of the podcast.
Yeah, the first thing I would say about Alabama is it seems like every talking head is like, yeah, it's over, wrap it up, season's done. And what I would say is Bryce Young was fantastic. And once we saw him go out there and he wasn't overwhelmed by the moment, like a game where Miami had about 11% chance to win coming in, suddenly had no chance. But I don't think he's going to be able to sustain the rate of production under pressure. And that is the one thing that we should focus on, is we have to keep an eye on Alabama's offensive line, because Bryce Young was pressured on 53% of his dropbacks. And so that is something to keep an eye on. And Georgia at number 2 is simply a byproduct of where their ceiling can be, because you and I know that the weapons they had missing from that game can take and propel Georgia to the next level. I mean, Darnell Washington did not play. Pickens did not play. Eric Gilbert still kind of figuring himself out and handling personal matters. Karras Jackson played with a knee brace after a cleanup 2 months ago. Jermaine Burton's first game since his knee injury. So you have key contributors that did not play in that game that can really propel Georgia to the next level. Ohio State will break down here in a couple moments, so no need to elaborate on them. But I don't think it's like a complete runaway. What I see from the media reporting on social media, like in their tweets, it's like, this thing's over. Alabama still has a hole or two.
I mean, the biggest thing about it, when you watch those games unfold, I think it's as much a reflection of where Miami is as a program. Our thoughts and feelings on Manny Diaz as a head coach are well documented around these parts. You never want to draw Alabama week one. Much like you said, Georgia's road arguably easier to get to the SEC title, knowing what the East looks like this year compared to Alabama having to go on the road and take on Texas A&M. So still a lot to be decided. Alabama a rightful number one, but Georgia will have all the potential in the world for Kirby to finally get over the hump and beat his mentor in Nick Saban. You mentioned Ohio State at number 3, and Ohio State will be participating in the marquee game of week 1, where they'll welcome in the Oregon Ducks. You're looking at Ohio State, a 14.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on this game, 63.5. Last meeting between these proud programs, Ohio State absolutely obliterated Oregon in the 2014 national title game, 42-20. Last year's game, scheduled for Autzen Stadium, canceled because of COVID protocols. And the reality of things, Payne, with this game, Ohio State has a lot of the intangible edges working in their favor. 2 extra days of prep time. Oregon travels across 3 time zones. And not only does Oregon travel across 3 time zones, they're doing it for breakfast football at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 o'clock Eastern. The other thing to consider, which I found interesting, Oregon's been a double-digit underdog 6 times. Now, of course, the last time happened back in 2017. As a program, haven't exactly fared so well in that role. 1-5 against the number, losing by an average of 25 points per game. Clearly a massive test for Mario Cristobal, and the Oregon Ducks are going to have to be a hell of a lot better on both sides of the ball than what we saw last weekend when they slipped by Fresno State 31-24.
Completely agree. And, just looking at this game, there's still some elements to it where we're not quite sure. And so when we get this extra data point, we'll obviously have a better indication of what these two teams are, what certain players are, and important players. I know when we did our Ohio State breakdown last week, a lot of it involved C.J. Stroud. And I know it's easy to talk quarterback. Anybody can do that. But it's important because Stroud provides this ceiling to what Ohio State's offense and team can be, and that's really important when you're trying to project ahead. And I think all things considered, Stroud played well in his first start in a hostile environment. And there were some misreads, no doubt about that. There was a really bad interception over the middle on a crosser to Olave with no pressure, where Stroud throws a ball so far behind Olave that a burnt defender trailing by 5 yards has a ball fall in his lap. So those were some of the issues. But if you look at his play in its entirety, under pressure, he was elite, 130 rating. He wanted to make Minnesota pay when they blitzed him and when they tried to pressure him. So he pushed the ball downfield, 16.3 yards an attempt and 2 touchdowns when pressured. The other big thing for me is in known passing situations. That was something that we said, hey, let's run some play action. Let's get Stroud throwing on early down so he's not facing known passing situations. All of a sudden, the guy just delivered. 10% above the national average in passing success rate in passing situations. They average 9 yards per play in those situations on any throw, 55% passing success rate. I thought Minnesota took a fluke lead into the break, and Ohio State's offense didn't really look great. You had the crowd in the game, and then all of a sudden comes out of the half, and he leads his offense to 6 explosive plays on the first 5 drives of the second half, and the game's all but over. So I thought Stroud did really well in the turmoil situations. He just needs reps and consistency. And I truly have no idea what Oregon's defense is. I liked Tim DeRuyter. We outlined him on the preview podcast. But we saw Fresno, an offense that we project outside the top 50 in efficiency, go on some really sustained drives. 12 for 69 yards, 14 for 68, 10 for 75, 9 for 85. Fresno was really good through the middle part of that game. Now, Oregon did well dominating the bookends to start and finish, but were very susceptible in the middle. And you could see stretches like that early in the season learning a brand new defense. And you look at Oregon's problems and where they've had some issues defensively the last couple seasons, specifically last year, they were susceptible through the air, just inside the top 90 in passing success rate defense, outside the top 35 in explosive pass defense. We know Ryan Day has a more vertical approach to his offense. And the one way that you can hinder the ability to stop the passing game and help your back end is pressure. We saw Ohio State starting center Harry Miller missed the Minnesota game with COVID. Let's see if he's back. That's a situation we'll have to monitor. His replacement was horrible in pass protection. But I don't know if Oregon has the horses on the interior of the defensive line. And then you have the factor of Kayvon Thibodeau, the ankle sprain. That is obviously a huge factor. He is unlikely to be near 100%, even if he does play. He is 100% going to be impacted to some degree if he's out there. Drew Mathis, Oregon's super senior and starting weak side linebacker, has a knee injury. He's not going to play. Now, what is interesting, and I think is a positive, which could help in this area of weakness I'm outlining, is that there's going to be some reinforcements back for Oregon secondary. As soon as you suffer injuries to key cogs up front and it's Ohio State week, suddenly the guys Cristobal suspended are magically available. So you're going to have your projected starters, Jamal Hill and DJ James, available for this game. Will Cristobal try to prove a point and not start him for the first series? Maybe, but they're going to be out there. And so that should help this area of weakness. And I think you hit it perfectly. Kind of the cursory glance here is that Ohio State has extra time, 2 extra days. They don't lose a day of the travel. Early breakfast football. I think that's all important. It's the reason you're seeing this game go across the key number of 14 here early in the week.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting when you look at the Oregon defense, obviously you hit on the key injury to Kayvon Thibodeau, whose status bears watching because he, is going to be potentially the number 1 pick in the draft. So it's not easy to replace that level of production. And one of the things that was the big takeaway as far as doing some reading after that Oregon win against Fresno State, they talked about a lack of communication on the defensive side. Well, if that's difficult to do in your own building, imagine what that becomes when you're in hostile territory, when things start to go a little bit haywire, and they are extremely young at the linebacker position, as you referenced the Drew Mathis injury. It puts Noah Sewell and Justin Flo in a position to be difference makers. We'll see exactly if they're up for the task. The other big thing in terms of Ohio State, as you broke down CJ Stroud, looking at his pass distribution chart, you always have to give Ryan Day a ton of credit. He threw 1 pass all night long between the hash marks. That 1 pass that you mentioned was the one that was intercepted. So they're going to do everything they can to try and get Olave and Wilson in spots to operate down the field. And of course, the wealth of riches that Ohio State seems to have in the backfield. When you look at the other side of the ball, Payne, I think you and I both came into this season wondering what Anthony Brown could be as the starting quarterback for Oregon. We know he's a dual threat guy that was going to have to lean on his running backs. And when you break down what CJ Verdell and Travis Dye were able to do, 31 carries for 138 yards against Fresno. This tandem's accounted for more than 4,500 yards rushing in their career. But the way to beat Ohio State, it's not running at the edges. It's not running between the tackles. It's trying to create a vertical passing game. Do the guys like Micah Pittman and company provide enough of a threat for Oregon to beat the Buckeyes over the top, an area where we've seen vulnerability, not just last week against Minnesota, but in the past and typically their Achilles heel?
I think there's 2 answers to that. And when you're looking at a game with a spread of 14.5, to stay within the number, Oregon's going to have to be able to run the ball because that's just who they are. 6 guys who started at least a game on the offensive line are back. It's a dominant unit up front. That's just how Mario Cristobal recruits. You have the veteran backs you mentioned in Verdell and Dye. They have to be dynamic. Anthony Brown needs to create an extra man advantage in the box with his legs and force the Buckeyes linebackers, who don't have a ton of playing experience, to be disciplined and make the right reads. That wasn't necessarily the case against Minnesota last week. But it could be tougher than what appears on the surface to establish that ground game. I mean, I thought Ohio State's defense did a decent job stopping the run. If you look at the EPA numbers, they don't look great, and it's because you give up a 56-yard gasher on 4th and 1 when a defender can't make a tackle in the hole 4 yards deep. Right?
Ibrahim did make a nice cut. I have to give him credit since that'll be the only highlight reel we get of him for the season as he's shelled for Minnesota. Did make a nice cut, making the Ohio State defender look to pick up his jockstrap that was left on the canvas.
Yeah, it's a missed tackle. Okay, and Ohio State gives up another gasher on the opening drive of the second half for a 20-yard touchdown. So those are the plays that are swinging the EPA metrics. But if you look down to down, which is always important to do, look at both. Ohio State's defense stuffed more than 31% of the Gophers' runs at or behind the line of scrimmage. They held Minnesota below the national average in yards per rush. And that is just one of the better O-lines that I think you're going to see in college football, just in terms of like a mass perspective. 5 guys on Minnesota go 320 plus. The right tackle's 400 pounds. So I don't think you can just look at how Minnesota ran the ball and assume that that's what's going to happen at the Horseshoe. So I think to keep this within the number, Oregon's got to be able to run the ball. But to your point, if Oregon wants a chance at winning this game, they're going to have to move the ball through the air. And it's going to be on Anthony Brown and the receivers to take advantage of a Buckeye secondary that has some questions, obviously. And they had questions last year. They had questions in game 1. I mean, this is a unit last year that was just barely inside the top 60 in the entire country in passing success rate allowed and explosive passing. And you look at Minnesota last week, it's like you lose your best returning wide receiver in Altman Bell. You're obviously transitioning away from Rashad Bateman, who was a first-round pick. And the Gophers still passing, just was fantastic. Positive .26 EPA per pass. Minnesota's 12% better than the national average in passing success rate. They average nearly 7 yards per pass attempt. So the Buckeyes can be had on the back end. I just don't know if Oregon actually has the horses out there to exploit it. And so that's the big thing. I mean, everyone's raving about Oregon and Mario Cristobal. And really, to me, when I look at it, it's like USC's down. Where is their competition west of Texas for recruits at this point? And so I just look at this team and I say that there is just question marks outside. And Oregon's pass attack has been fairly weak the last few seasons relative to what we've grown Oregon football to be. Anthony Brown's never been known as an elite passer. You look last week against Fresno, just 4 explosive passes. They finished the week outside the top 60 in EPA per pass. And there's just a real lack of punch there. It's why you average 5.1 yards per play against Fresno. Now, something informational here, Todd. The projected starting corners for Ohio State, Cameron Brown, Sevion Banks, did not play against Minnesota. We're going to have to monitor that throughout the week because Cameron Brown is healthy. Was it COVID? Was it discipline? We'll see. Sevion Banks is working his way back from injury, obviously, but he was on the field for warm-ups against Minnesota. One or both of those corners for Ohio State returning could change some things in this game.
For sure, and I think I'm glad you hit on that point talking about Banks because they said he was actually listed as the emergency corner in that game, so it'd be a hell of a lot more precarious situation if he did not travel with the team, but being dressed and in uniform speaks volumes that he's a lot closer to a return, and of course, Ohio State will have all hands on deck for this game, a chance to go a long way in terms of proving their overall merits as one of the top teams in the country. We'll see if Oregon can make that leap up into elite status, pulling off the outright upset, but more importantly, for our order of business around here, will they have enough in that department to cover as a 14.5-point dog? From one Big Ten venue to a Big 12 venue that'll welcome in a Big Ten foe. That, of course, being the annual Cyhawk showdown between Iowa and Iowa State, where you're looking at Iowa State, a modest 4.5-point home favorite at Jack Trice Stadium at FanDuel Sportsbook, total on the game at 46. Payne, what we know about these two teams, we talked about Iowa State. They outlasted UNI last week, 16-10, closed as a 28-point favorite, never flirted with a cover in that spot. Meanwhile, to the untrained eye, Iowa absolutely obliterated Indiana en route to a 34-6 win. When you look at the series history here, last year was the first time this rivalry wasn't played since 1976. This will be the first time that both of these teams will enter the Cyhawk showdown as ranked foes, so it should be something to watch there. Iowa State will be favored over Iowa for the first time since 2000. That was actually Kirk Ferentz's second season with the Hawkeyes. And this stat blew me away, but it just goes to show how dismal this program has been on the whole. Iowa State favored over a top 20 opponent, Payne, for the first time in 40 years. They've played 131 games in that span. Simply incredible to see what Matt Campbell has done to return this program to relevancy. Last 5 meetings, Iowa has won by an average margin that's not worth sharing for Cyclones fans. But I will say under has been the order of the day. The last 15 meetings between these teams, under has gone 13-2. The average points per game, less than 41 a contest. When you look at this Iowa team, Payne, they don't blow you away with anything they do on the offensive side of the ball, but during a 7-game win streak stretching back to last year, they've outscored opponents 248-89, and they lead the country in yards per play defense. All of those metrics will get tested against a Brock Purdy and Breece Hall-led offense.
It's really an interesting Iowa team that I just can't quite figure out. But, looking at Iowa's defense on paper coming into the season, especially early on, before guys develop and adapt to these new enhanced roles, the weakness appeared to be along Iowa's defensive line. I like Iowa's linebackers. The secondary is fantastic. But let's not kid ourselves. And you hit this perfectly. Indiana was not a test. Not when Tom Allen chose to trot out Michael Penix 8 months removed from ACL surgery, the second surgery on the same knee. Okay?
And one thing about that, too, I was going to say, there were rumors circulating all Saturday morning that Penix might not even be available to go in that game.
Yes, there was. We were poking around, spending the morning on that because you kind of put that across my desk, and I started poking around, and I sent some notes, and no one could really confirm it. And when you saw him out there, 60, 65%, 70%, if I'm being nice at best, he couldn't step into throws. And he didn't have an off season working with his receivers or building timing and chemistry. We know the weakest part of Indiana's offense has been their O-line. I mean, you know how you go out and dominate an offense? It's like go against a quarterback that's 65% healthy with virtually no off season and an O-line that you might as well just have stuck orange cones out there. I mean, Penix was pressured on nearly 40% of his dropbacks. He had a 1.7 passer rating when pressured. 1.7. Completed 3 of 11 passes for 1.9 yards an attempt when pressured. That's not going to be what Iowa faces this week, right? I mean, the Cyclones offense returns all 5 starters along the O-line. You have an all-world running back in Breece Hall. You have a fully capable quarterback in Brock Purdy. This isn't the Hoosiers O-line that has serious question marks. It's a great O-line. It's a horse in the backfield. It feels like Iowa State might have success on the ground to some level, right? I mean, that wasn't an area where Iowa was elite last year before they lost some of these guys to the NFL. They were outside the top 25 in line yards and stuff rate and finished outside the top 35 in rushing success rate allowed against really an unimaginative Big Ten slate of offenses last year. So, with Iowa State, I look at that game and I say, kind of saw that coming. It was a similar situation to what we had last year where Iowa State kind of sputtered out of the gate against Louisiana, and then they went on the road the next game against Gary Patterson's defense and hung 420-plus yards and 37 points, and Brock Purdy was fantastic. On the road against Gary Patterson, 78% adjusted completion percentage in that game, 9.2 an attempt, 119 passer rating. That was kind of what we discussed in this preseason preview of the Big 12. It was like, can Matt Campbell get out of September? Can he get away from that opening game where it just looks like they are disinterested, which is just odd for a group of players and coaches that are kind of built the way they are. But when I look at this game, it could be a grinder. Iowa State obviously has the better O-line, better D-line, better quarterback, running back. The positive also is All-American tight end. Charlie Kohler was held out against UNI, went through warm-ups, expect him back this week. The other thing to mention here, and you hit on this perfectly, I believe you said the series recently averaged about 41 points. And you have 2 teams here that play below average paces. Both averaged roughly 70 snaps per game last season. That was outside the top 85. Both were around 65 offensive snaps in week 1. It'll be interesting to see with this total, knowing it's where College game day is going to be, knowing it'll probably be one of the biggest games on Saturday, if this total gets worked on a little bit here and pushed up. And if for some reason 48 pops, that's going to be like seeing sharks in a feeding frenzy, I would guess. And if you look at the weather right now, things can obviously change 72 hours out, but we're kind of on that cusp of wind actually playing a role, projected 16 miles per hour with gusts higher. So that'll be an interesting total to monitor as this week progresses.
Yeah, and when you look at this Iowa State offense, I mean, you talked about it. Some of the guys that are veteran leaders, Breece Hall, one of the more dynamic players in the entire country. And I was kind of surprised when I dug into some of his numbers, not metrically relatable, but just to try and put what he's done in perspective. He's third in the nation for scrimmage yards since the start of last season, behind only two members of the Alabama Crimson Tide that have now taken their talents to the NFL, Najee Harris and Devontae Smith. Only Devin Singletary has a longer streak of consecutive games with a rushing touchdown in the last 5 years. And when you look at Breece Hall, he was relatively slow by his standards getting out of the gates. 3 yards per carry, did have 100 yards from scrimmage, but it was a workmanlike effort where he was never able to build some momentum. You'd hope that he finds a little spring in his step and can carry that into this contest here. But on the other side of the ball, Payne, Iowa's offense, despite that 34-6 scoreline, did absolutely nothing to blow you away. I mean, they averaged well less than 5 yards per play. 56 of their 300 yards of offense came on Tyler Goodson's early touchdown run. Spencer Petras, 13 of 27 for $145, and Iowa, as a complete unit, gained 40% of their available offensive yards in the contest. Guess what? Going up against Iowa State in a tight game defensively, going to be significantly more difficult than when you're playing downhill after your defense puts you in the catbird seat last week against Indiana.
Absolutely. And none of the questions I had about Iowa's offense were answered last week. And you hit this perfectly. You look at this score of 34-6 and you're thinking, Iowa dominated. The score says Iowa's offense was efficient and the defense was dominant. Reality is Iowa's offensive production was basically 3 explosive plays. That's it. The 56-yard run by Goodson, which you mentioned, but he was held to 2.3 a carry on his 18 other runs. So you immediately wonder about an Iowa O-line that lost 3 starters, both its tackles and its center, right? The 3 most important positions along the O-line, not just in talent, but in the value of the position lost. The accuracy questions we had about Spencer Petras coming into the season only got magnified. 62% adjusted completion accuracy from a clean pocket. And the kicker averaged 5.8 an attempt from the clean pocket. We said this in the Big Ten preview, Todd, right? You can't be a conservative passer and inaccurate. Not a good combination. And pass protection wasn't very good for Iowa. He was pressured on 41% of his dropbacks. Now, give Indiana credit. Lots of returning production defensively. Still a unit projected, just outside our top 30 in efficiency coming into the year. But again, Iowa State's a different animal, right? This is a top 15 defense with more talent, with more returning production than Indiana. You look at how John Heacock's defense has kind of molded some new things in college football, and he is partly responsible for Matt Campbell being so good at Iowa State. It's this quirky, innovative defense that will play 3 safeties many times. They'll only have, 5 guys in the box. They'll send pressure with that 5th guy from anywhere. Could be a corner, could be a safety, could be a linebacker. They call it a fire zone. So basically they're rushing 5. There's 3 guys in the middle protecting the seams, and then you have 3 deep. But it works. They have managed as a defense to create havoc without a ton of guys in the box, which is surprising. And if you can create pressure without sending a bunch, you're going to be a pretty successful defense. Now, when I look at this a little bit, it's 2021, obviously, and you need to be able to pass to win. And so that's going to be the big thing here from Petras. I know they want to rely on the ground game, but Petras is going to have to make some throws. And you have a receiver group that is down its top 2 weapons from last season. There didn't seem to be a lot of game breakers from what I watched in the Indiana game. Not a lot of guys that can create separation, not a lot of guys that can consistently win one-on-one. I know the hope is that the O-line is better this week and Goodson can create some plays to keep Iowa State's defense honest, right? You want a ground game here that maybe makes Iowa State adjust and throw another guy in the box so that when Petras does attempt to throw the ball downfield, there's less congestion and he can be a more efficient passer. But I don't know if that's going to happen. I just don't see Iowa doing much on this side of the ball. It feels like a game for Iowa and maybe even Iowa State, we'll see, where if you can pick up a couple first downs, don't make a mistake, punt it away, play for field position, that's not a terrible drive. But if you turn it over, then this game potentially gets ugly quick. You really just dig into some of these metrics. You dig into some of what we saw from last week. And on the surface, again, for Iowa State's defense even, it looks like UNI was able to, move the ball just a little bit. But I watched that game because I just want to see what Iowa State is. I enjoy watching them. But, a lot of the big plays they gave up were just missed tackles. So if you can clean that up, you're looking at an Iowa State defense that is going to be elite. But just in terms of some of the yards per play metrics, I mean, they gave up a 37-yard explosive. 2 plays later, they gave up a 52-yard explosive. It's defenders whiffing on tackles. If you make those tackles, Iowa State only gives up 3.2 yards per play last week. I just don't see many advantages for Iowa's offense here, Todd.
No, and I'm right there with you. I think when you look at Iowa State, this isn't a team that gets beat up physically in the trenches. So if Iowa isn't able to establish a ground game, I don't think that Petrus at this point in his career can use weapons like Sam Laporta or Tyrone Tracy or Charlie Jones to consistently win one-on-one matchups and really put Iowa State defensively on its heels. Because as we've seen before, and we can look at the bowl game last year, when they sold out to take away Oregon's ground game, it really snuffed out what the Ducks wanted to do, and Iowa DNA will always continue to remain a run-first offense, all about Goodson. Take him out, and then take your chances that Petrus can beat you with a vertical passing game. From one Big 12 program, though, playing host to a marquee game, a nice little segue into a Big 12 team going onto the road where it's Texas, headed to Fayetteville. It's the Longhorns, a 6.5-point road favorite. Total in this game has been bet down a touch to 55.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. This will be a rivalry renewed in a sold-out stadium, the first for Arkansas since 2017. Of course, these teams might play a heck of a lot more regularly when Texas makes its full migration into the SEC. When you look at Steve Sarkisian, he has experienced life against the Arkansas Razorbacks last season. Alabama dropped 50 points on them in that particular spot. It is, however, a very young Texas team playing in their first true road environment, and Texas coaches weren't afraid to share that as one of their potential concerns. But to the Longhorns' credit, Payne, they were very workmanlike, and I don't think they got enough credit for their effort against Louisiana, 38-18, a game that wasn't even really all that close. Meanwhile, Arkansas, they needed to score 3 late touchdowns to get outside the number against Rice, a victory and a cover that you told me was never in doubt.
There was some actual sharp money there on Arkansas, even on game day, laid the 19. So that's living a good, clean life there. I agree with you on Texas. I mean, for an opening performance, I thought they showed well. Exceeded expectation. It's game one. Sark doesn't have his own players. The players themselves are adapting to a new scheme. Some of the players aren't really a scheme fit. And you're against a Louisiana defense that returned the most production year over year. So, that's no slouch of a defense. We projected Louisiana top 40 in defensive efficiency coming into the year. And you look at what the Longhorns were able to do, 0.25 EPA per play, good for 19th best in the country. Bijan Robinson, who we raved about in the Big 12 podcast, showed that he is dynamic and he is a workhorse. That is a good combination to have at running back. Hudson Card, pleasant surprise there. 82% adjusted completion percentage, 10.7 yards an attempt, didn't have a single turnover-worthy play, had a passer rating when the O-line kept him clean that was just out of this world. Now, I will say this. Everything sounds great, but there are 2 things to look for against Arkansas's defense. The first is up front. And I went into spring ball thinking that the Texas O-line with 4 starters back and snagging Alabama's O-line coach would turn this into just a really, really solid unit. But if you remember back in our Big 12 preview, we said the Texas O-line had been just getting absolutely trounced. The first and second team defenses bullied the O-line in the spring game. My sources tell me that continued throughout fall camp. And then again in game 1 against Louisiana, Hudson Card was pressuring 50% of his dropbacks. So Texas didn't protect its quarterback. Per PFF, Texas is 90th as well in run blocking. So the O-line does have some questions. Now, is Arkansas going to be the defense to exploit that and take advantage of it? I'm not sure. Arkansas struggled last season up front, 102nd in line yards, 80th in stuff rate, barely inside the top 100 in rushing success rate allowed. So the question becomes is which line with substantial question marks wins that battle? Because if Arkansas creates a stalemate up front and you keep Bijan Robinson from just going absolutely nuclear, they might have a chance. Because the one thing that I kind of pinpointed in Texas's opening game performance that is due to regress is Hudson Card and what Texas did on third down last week.
Third and 8, third and 10, third and 12, no problem. Throw the ball into triple coverage.
It didn't matter. The third down conversion rate is absolutely going to normalize here. Texas converted 69% of their third downs against Louisiana. And these were no gimmies. Average third down distance to go was nearly 8 yards. If that's the situation this week, and you have an Arkansas secondary that returns 4 starters and 8 guys back there with starting experience, then Arkansas might be able to hang around here. So as you're watching this game, right, look to see which line controls the trenches, because that will be big, for 2 units that, aren't great. And then if Texas is faced with these third and long situations like last week, I would fully expect Arkansas to be a little bit better, and we'll see Texas regress through the air. So those are the 2 things that I think are key on this side of the ball, Todd.
When you look at the other side of the ball, the one thing that stood out for me was actually watching Texas defenders make tackles, something that was absent during the Tom Herman era. They were sure-handed, didn't allow Lafayette or Louisiana to create those big plays with a talented quarterback in Levi Lewis. He struggled a little bit with accuracy downfield, which I think masked some of Texas's cover concerns. But when you look at this team overall, they only allowed 1 explosive run to a dynamic ground game. Most of Louisiana's success came in the fourth quarter when it was already a 3-score game, and we saw flashes of what DeMarvion Overshawn can be, a player that was highly touted coming in that a lot of people had expectations for. Now, against an Arkansas offense, Payne, I think it was funny. You texted me yesterday. You said you went back and watched some of the game against Rice, and I believe you had serious questions about KJ Jefferson. I can let you share those. Yes, he graded out the top running quarterback amongst PFF for week 1, but I think his accuracy leaves an awful lot to be desired.
What I like about this matchup is it's 2 coordinators that I'm just head over heels for. I love Kendall Briles. And there wasn't anyone I think we gave more love to than the Texas DC Pete Kwiatkowski in our preview series this year. And so this will be a fun little cat and mouse game. And it just does feel like Texas has the advantage, though, on the side of the ball, unless KJ Jefferson does things that we haven't seen from him before. Struggle City, obviously, out of the gate against Rice. He started the game 4 of 10 with a pick. Did, obviously, I believe, go 8 for his next 11 down the stretch and propelled Arkansas to the win in some 3 scoring drives in the fourth quarter. His best attributes are his legs and his size. And I will actually throw this back to you and give you credit, because you pointed out that the interesting factor in this game is that Texas saw a quarterback similar to this last week with Levi Lewis. And so what ended up happening is about 10 o'clock last night, I went down a wormhole. And so
that's usually dangerous. This was a football wormhole this time, right? Just to clarify.
This was a football wormhole.
Okay.
Yes.
I feel a little bit better.
So, you have this Texas defense that spent the entire offseason basically preparing for a dual threat quarterback in Levi Lewis from Louisiana. And now you get another mobile quarterback in KJ Jefferson in week 2, where you can kind of just go back and refine things, tweak things that are more specific to Arkansas. But what I did was, and I didn't go all the way back, but I went into the most recent times. And so what I wanted to find out was how Pete Kwiatkowski's defense fared against mobile quarterbacks. And so I started digging, and we know that Kwiatkowski is kind of a legend for his innovation, one of the very first defensive coordinators to go with a 4-2-5 defense. It's built around stopping today's past first times, right, in passing offenses. But when you also play a 4-2-5 and you have linebackers and ends that are changing and they're versatile, and obviously you have more speed on the field with a 5th defensive back, it's allowed Kwiatkowski to do really well in recent games against mobile quarterbacks. So, obviously, Levi Lewis, 10 yards rushing on 2 designed runs. He was forced to be a pocket passer. And then I went back and you think about the Pac-12 days where Kwiatkowski was the Washington Husky DC and he faced the likes of, Tyler Huntley and Khalil Tate and Jason Shelley, real mobile quarterbacks. And in 2009 against Arizona and Khalil Tate, Kwiatkowski held Tate to 18 yards on 4 designed runs. Did a fantastic job keeping him in the pocket, making him a pocket passer in that game. Same year against Utah, Tyler Huntley was held to 16 yards on 4 designed runs. Now in 18, Huntley was able to break a few, right? 9 design runs for 54 yards, but had a ton of miscues, turned the ball over, sacked a bunch. Utah was held to 7 points in that game. And then that same year, Washington faced Utah for a second time, and they had Jason Shelley, who was also a dual threat quarterback. 5 yards on 7 designed runs. So I could see a situation here where we're expecting KJ Jefferson's legs to just be uber dynamic, or they would need to be uber dynamic to pull off this upset. And you just kind of look at history and the 4-2-5 defense being speed-based, and that might not be the case. Now, KJ Jefferson probably can run someone over. He's the size of a tight end. But that becomes the interesting part about this, because you're going to make KJ Jefferson try to beat you through the air, but the defense of a 4-2-5 is designed to stop the pass, and it's designed to stop explosives through the air. It really makes you methodically move the ball downfield. And so I don't know if KJ Jefferson's able to do that. And even you look last week, a guy like Levy Lewis, if you're looking at generic stats, you may say like, hey, 28 for 40, not bad when you're stepping up in class. But Texas kept everything in front. Levy Lewis had a 4.6 yard ADOT. You're not threatening a defense with a 4.6 yard average depth of target. You're just not. And so it just feels like when you look at the entire game here, that Texas this season is more buttoned up. They're better coached than last year. I saw them in the spring game. They looked buttoned up. Fall camp, everything was good. Game 1, you mentioned, Todd, about how well they tackled. That was something where last year they were outside the top 110 in terms of tackle percentage. Just not very good. It just feels like a much more buttoned up defense, one that we called for an immediate upgrade in our Big 12 preview.
And not to pile on this Arkansas offense completely, they should look a little bit better in the passing game. Treylon Burks missed a lot of time throughout fall camp, was a late returnee to practice. He flat out came out and said that he was rusty in terms of his routes, wasn't on the same page as KJ Jefferson. So we'll see if that's something that Arkansas can get going the second time around. But when you look at this Arkansas offense, sure, they may have found a little bit of something late in that game. In reality, they still only gained 36% of their available offensive yards in the contest and picked up 2 or more first downs on just a third of their offensive series, something that's going to have to be significantly better when they step up in class. And, to your points about Pete Kwiatkowski, Payne, it may speak to why we've started to see a little bit of an under money trickling into the market early this morning from 57 at the peak down to 55.5. Perfect time to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, to go on Twitter, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod, follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider, and you can follow me there as well at Todd Fuhrman. Also, go over to the Bet the Board YouTube page, subscribe. Big news coming there. You're going to want to be subscribed for all the updates and alerts as we have some special things on the horizon for the season. And also, FanDuel.com/BetTheBoard. Take advantage of all their aggressive sign-up bonuses, promos in states where applicable. Arizona, we're looking at you just in time for the start of the National Football League schedule. Last but not least, Payne, this game had a little bit more cachet on paper when we looked at the schedule before the season. Week 1 threw a wrench into some of the best laid plans. That, of course, is the primetime showdown in Ann Arbor, where Michigan will welcome in the Washington Huskies. You're looking at Michigan now, a touchdown favorite. Total in this game, 48.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. Look ahead numbers during the summer. Well, that had Washington a modest road favorite. Oh, how things can change when you lose outright as a 22.5 point favorite to an FCS member in Montana. Interestingly enough, Washington became only the 5th FBS ranked team ever to lose to an FCS school. Who was the first, you ask? That was the Michigan Wolverines back in 2007 against Appalachian State. And I think the first question I have to ask, Payne, before we even get into
the first thing I ever want to say is I don't want to hear that noise out of you ever again.
Which particular noise? I make a lot of uncomfortable noise. Before we get into the X's and O's of this game, I did want to ask you one question. When you see a result like we did week 1 with a team like Washington, take out of the equation that you and I were not high on the Huskies coming into the season, not nearly as high, obviously, as a lot of the betting market and some of the other preseason prognostications that we'd seen. What do you do to make sure you don't overreact, but at the same time, you don't want to underreact when you have that kind of poor result where you muster a grand total of 7 points against an inferior opponent in your own building?
Not specific necessarily to Washington, but in general for betting, you'll always hear don't make these large adjustments just based on 60 minutes of football. And no doubt that's accurate. But when you're talking about the early parts of the season, you are making your largest adjustments at that point. If you're making massive adjustments in weeks 7, 8, 9, 10, and it isn't because of injuries, there's probably there's probably an issue to your initial power ratings. So this isn't a shock for me. I wasn't high on Washington coming into the season. We had Jimmy Lake parade around with his run the damn ball hats and T-shirts, basically mocking analytics and the way football should be played in 2021, and he got punched in the nose and didn't fight back. And so that's where we are with Washington. But I agree that this adjustment might be a touch too much.
And when you look at Washington, the reality of it was, hey, look, they didn't do anything to light the world on fire offensively by any stretch of the imagination. But from a defensive standpoint, this team played exceptionally well. You can only do so much if your counterparts on the other side of the ball aren't going to get it done. But when you look at this matchup, which side of the ball you think is worth starting on? Michigan's offense against that Huskies defense, or to see if Washington's offense can rebound against the Michigan defense that I think a lot of us had questions about coming into the season?
It doesn't matter, but I think the transition point is continuing to crap on Jimmy Lake, so I'll go ahead and take that up.
All right, let's go. Take the low-hanging fruit, baby. That's what I'm talking about on a Wednesday morning.
It's just, not a fan, and not a great way to kick off your career. And I think that's probably the most embarrassing loss in program history that's now in his hands. And the questions we had were not answered. We questioned the offensive coordinator hire of John Donovan. That's a guy who spent 2 years at Penn State, was responsible for an offense that finished 110th and 71st in efficiency those 2 years. That says hireable, doesn't it? And so...
Was Ray Donovan not available?
I don't think Ray Donovan was available, no. I still haven't gotten into that show, by the way. I want to.
I haven't either. I've watched an episode or two. I didn't really watch Better Call Saul, but I mean, you pick on me for my show watching or lack thereof. So, I mean, the laundry list of shows I haven't seen. When you informed me that Chalky White passed away earlier this week, I think you were mortified that I'd never actually seen an episode of The Wire.
You hadn't seen The Wire? No. You did see Boardwalk, though, which is where the
Chalky
White character came from.
I watched Boardwalk in its entirety. I'm a big Steve Buscemi fan.
That show was fantastic. That's one that I really miss. All right. Now back to the game. I didn't like anything I saw last week. It brought me back to watching Penn State's offenses in 2015. There just wasn't much going on. It wasn't an innovative offense. You saw an OC that didn't adapt. There was very little disguise in what he was doing. No adjustments. It was like he called the game based on what he thought it would be when he put the game plan together Tuesday from his home office. It just was bad. We mentioned the receiver group. I know off air, no one's keeping you up at night as an opposing defensive coordinator when you look at that receiver group. And there's some issues there, right, with injuries and suspensions. And then they lost another guy in game. Dylan Morris looked serviceable. And
that might be nice. That might be generous to say he looks serviceable, but I don't want to rip apart a kid that's under 22 years of age. Not on this podcast, at least.
Well, listen, now that we got the NIL stuff and they're paid, I think we have to kind of loosen those restrictions.
That's a very good point. But if Dylan Morris was paid, he probably should have to give back his paycheck.
Agreed. And, it's tough because he's not operating a system that's, run optimally, being called optimally. He's got a 5-star quarterback looking over his shoulder. There's a lot of pressure there. But the one thing that shocked me was we came into this season saying Washington might be better than we think because they could rely on an offensive line in a ground game, and the schedule of run defenses weren't great. We saw a team that was returning 5 starters along the O-line, and they're massive and they're good. 6'5", 325 is the average. Got a couple NFL caliber guys, a left tackle and Jason Kirkland that could potentially be a first-round pick. Not if he played like he did last week, but potentially. And Montana just dominated them up front. Now, let's kind of put this in perspective. Montana's no slouch, top 5 FCS team, but the talent
Bobby
gap is
Houck.
huge.
Bobby Houck, UNLV legend, taking things over in Missoula, trying to restore them to prominence.
Yeah, how's your current UNLV?
Don't even get me started.
Going?
I begrudgingly watched the entire second half of UNLV against Eastern Washington. Let me tell you, Payne, that's 2 hours of my life I'm not going to be able to get back anytime soon.
I just have no idea how ADs hire people. Like, it is just brutal. Anyways, the talent gap it's still big there. Washington can't be held to 3.8 a carry, only 2 explosive runs. And then when you dig into the actual data, John Donovan might as well handed Montana the diagram of his offense and where they were going to run. 23 running back carries, not a single one was outside the tackles. Nothing but power, nothing but inside zone. Maybe let an athlete be an athlete and get to the edge. Maybe. Especially when you have more talent than the opposing team. Just a thought. But, there's no doubt in my mind after a performance like that. Washington is on high alert this week. You are can't wait. You're chomping at the bit to get back onto the practice field. There's going to be full buy-in. It's going to be all business this week. But what's the game plan? I don't know what that's going to look like. Dylan Morris obviously struggled. You didn't help him as an OC. For some reason, only 22% play action rate. On any other drop back without play action, Dylan Morris had a 39 passer rating and 3 picks, maybe a little more play action. So I don't know what that's going to look like offensively. And in this matchup, you're going to need Dylan Morris to be better. You're going to need the O-line to bully Michigan in the trenches. And it's just funny how 60 minutes of football can change perceptions, because the area of concern for Michigan defensively coming into the season, aside from getting acclimated to a new defensive scheme, was their D-line. But I was kind of impressed with Michigan's defense. Western Michigan, again, is no cupcake. That's a top 50 type offense. And the only points Western Michigan scored was on the opening drive and in garbage time down 40 with 3 to 4 minutes left. And you look at the opening drive touchdown, there was a 15-yard unsportsmanlike conduct penalty. So instead of 3rd and 10 and way behind the chains, it turned into an automatic first down that kept that drive alive. And so, I think Michigan's defense is much better than I expected. I thought that was a really game performance. But you come back to this, and while this sounds really bad for Washington, what I'm about to say probably trumps anything about this game in terms of importance. If this game was played last week, Michigan would have been a 1.5-point favorite. You've now gone through the 3, the 4, the 6, and you're at 7. The debate ultimately becomes that 5.5-point adjustment. We know it's warranted because we don't really like what Washington does offensively. And they aren't just suddenly going to grow some weapons on trees and bring them to Michigan this week. Is the 5.5-point adjustment, we know it's not warranted, but is the coaching that bad that we might not be able to account for what Washington truly is, right? You get situations like this, Todd, where 2 months from now, you're like, holy shit, this is like the worst coach team in college football.
Yeah, you go laying 7 with Michigan was an absolute steal.
Yes, and so that's something you don't want to run yourself into, but in the current present day and moment, I don't see a situation where you could possibly go to the ticket window and say, 378 minus 7, please. I just don't see that.
Well, I can tell you one thing. If you believe that Washington, this isn't enough of an overreaction, you can take advantage of the price on Oregon to win the Pac-12 North, where they're still only a modest favorite of minus $1.30, given the way the rest of the division looked, from Washington State to Stanford to Cal. If Washington's going to be no good, Oregon may have this thing wrapped up by early November. Now, if Washington's going to have some success in this game, Payne, it's obviously going to come from the defensive side of the ball, where the Huskies were no slouch despite the losing effort. They held Montana to a shade more than 4 yards per play. 15% of Montana's drives accounted for 2 first downs or more. Montana's quarterback only 12 of 23 for 105 yards. And when we look at Michigan offensively, hey, look, they got back to some of their basics. They ran the ball on 24 out of 34 offensive snaps in the first half. And for a team that gravitates towards running DNA, or at least has in the past under Coach Harbaugh, it's going to be easier for him to justify that decision-making process when you now factor in that Ronnie Bell has been lost for the season. The most accomplished returning receiver on that roster. And when you look at some of the other guys that are out there, whether it's Dalen Baldwin, Cornelius Johnson, Roman Wilson, AJ Henning, the one biggest takeaway for me, all the Michigan coaches, none of those receivers embody the full complement of traits as Ronnie Bell. It's almost patchwork deals. This guy's a burner, this guy's a possession receiver that doesn't create some of those elements and matchup problems on the outside.
Absolutely. And, trying to kind of remove from what I saw last week, I do think it's safe to say Washington's defense is the better of the two units here. And if Jimmy Lake, a guy that has made his bones being a defensive guy, suddenly has a poor defense, like Washington's in bigger trouble than we thought as a program under this current regime. It's still a top 20 defense based on our projections. And I thought the defense played really well against Montana. Obviously, Michigan had an offensive outburst. Wolverine fans were probably very excited. They hadn't seen that in a while. And no doubt you can only play who's on the schedule and who's in front of you. And from that perspective, Michigan was dominant. They controlled the trenches. They put up a positive .36 EPA per run. You saw Cade McNamara be uber efficient when he did drop back to pass. Wasn't very often, but he was super efficient. Only threw 11 times, but his adjusted accuracy was 100%. He was not only accurate, but he was decisive. He got the ball out on time. And the interesting part was when Western Michigan did blitz him, he was able to identify it, and he tried to make them pay. That was the 76-yard touchdown to Ronnie Bell. It was him identifying blitz pre-snap and then saying, hey, I'm going to make you pay for this. And so a massive explosive down the field. In saying that, Western Michigan's defense, we projected them to be outside the top 110 in efficiency. We expected them to be bullied. Western Michigan had one of the lowest returning defensive production rates in the country. So that has to be factored into that performance, obviously. In terms of play calling and style, I think this game is going to be really telling for what Michigan's offense is. Obviously, Michigan isn't going to run the ball 72% of snaps. They're not going to only snap it 61 times on offense. But what I proposed to you off air was you do wonder if Harbaugh, who hasn't seen things progress offensively as much as he would have liked with Josh Gaddis over the first 2 seasons, said, hey, let's rein this thing in. Let's bring it back in. Let's run it a little bit more. And so that'll be a fun data point to see in a game like this. Obviously, you mentioned the big blow to Ronnie Bell. He was the best weapon that they had. He's out for the season. The other thing that you want to factor in, and again, we're 72 hours out. Weather changes every 20 minutes, so you want to monitor this. But we are looking, as of right now, 20-mile-per-hour projected winds with gusts higher. And so when you start to get around that 15-mile-per-hour range, that's when wind has an impact. So we have seen this total come down a little bit from the open, right? Pretty much open 51 across the board. Group hit it yesterday. We're now out to 49. The question becomes is the second number still of value? 51 key number, 48 is the next key number. If you're going under, you obviously want to get ahead of that second key number. The question becomes, does the second number still have value?
Yeah, interesting trend too as you talk about totals. And of course, you never want to make blanket generalizations because I think it puts especially novice bettors into a trap they're going to find themselves chasing uphill. Teams involving FBS opponents, I believe last week, Payne, the number was 44 and 22 to the under. Interested to see the regression there. That was all the talk during NFL preseason. Oh, these games are going under. When we got to week 3 of the preseason, it felt like every game flew over by about 15 to 20 points. Again, not something that you apply as a blanket rule by any stretch of the imagination. Just something to keep in mind when you look at the way the market responds, especially for some of these totals that move from their open and where they ultimately get settled. But there's no doubt this could be one of the biggest games, as you mentioned, in the Jimmy Lake era. If Washington goes out there and lays yet another egg, the Boo Birds will come out in full force, and they're going to long for the days of Chris Peterson, who I don't think looked all that comfortable on the Fox set last week, so maybe you can get him back to Seattle to kind of resurrect the program if they do fall on hard times.
I think there's something going on there health-wise.
I would echo those same sentiments. It's not quite what we saw in the show Billions, but I think Peterson needed to step away for his own health and well-being. He does look, honestly, and I don't want to speculate because we obviously don't know what's going on behind the scenes, does look like he's aged quite a bit over the last 3 to 5 years since taking over in Washington.
West Coast living, baby.
Hey, well, as long as it's good, clean living, not living like Mark Few, I think everybody's in good shape. But 4 games broken down. We obviously like to try and tackle the biggest games on the board. Week 2 didn't afford us all of that many opportunities, hence us diving into our first unveiling of the Bet the Board Top 10. Again, I want to remind all of you guys, trying to do more as well with written content this season on our website, bettheboardpodcast.com. Some great articles about covering DNA, traits of what can make you a winning bettor if this is your first foray into college football, and of course the National Football League that'll get cranked up in earnest. Take advantage of all of those resources at your disposal. Payne, one final order of business to transact here on this Wednesday morning, and that's trying to find a game that provides an investable opportunity. Where are our travels taking us this weekend?
Let's go with the game we just finished talking about. The number is not up everywhere, and the current number is 24.5 juiced under, but let's, for the sake of the podcast, call it under 24 first half Washington, Michigan. So 24 or better is the buy price for this week's best bet.
Love it. We're going back to our true roots, the DNA that has made this podcast a fixture, a staple in all college handicappers' arsenal of tools to take advantage of. So Washington and Michigan, as Payne mentioned, 377, 378, your betting index number. Although, Payne, I will say one thing, not to go on a tangent before I close up shop. I was a little bit concerned. I had a number of folks reach out. What do you guys mean when you give us a betting number? And it scares me about the current direction and trajectory our industry is going as a whole.
Agreed. And I think anyone giving out information on social media, if you're not using a rotation number, that really irks me. So do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. Get your shop in order, folks. Try and be able to do that. So under 24 first half, Michigan and Washington, nothing like rooting for punts and hopefully a little bit of inclement weather in Ann Arbor Saturday evening. Follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Come Saturday night with a first half under ticket in hand. We'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.